So many of you maybe are not going to end up on CNN or have as visible successes as this, but all of you do have the Captain Sullys and the people who are growing in your organizations and for whom you are responsible to provide training and development opportunities. And hopefully you will also have, maybe not as visible, but as many happy stories as this one turned out to be. I want to begin actually by giving you a little sample of some training. And we're going to play this, and I'm going to ask you to grade it when we're done. So let's listen to a little clip. It's about Excel, and we'll see what you think about it.
We're going to learn how a store owner, Barb, might use a spreadsheet. Barb has entered her sales revenue and her overheads for last year into this spreadsheet. The first thing that Barb would like to know is how much profit she made for each month last year. First, let's enter a label for profit. In cell A6, we'll enter the label profit in thousands of dollars. Good. Now let's figure out what Barb's profit was for the month of January. Profit is generally calculated by subtracting overhead from sales revenue, giving a profit of $40,000. You could continue to manually enter profit for the other 11 months. However, you can also take advantage of Excel's formula functionality by using.
Okay, so that gives you a little flavor of this multimedia Excel lesson. Thinking about it now from an instructional perspective, I'm going to ask you to grade it. And so as you think about it right now, how many of you are going to give it an A or a B? Raise your hand. It's pretty good, an A or a B. Okay, I see a few, 2 or 3 people out there. Those are nice, lenient graders. How many of you are going to say, well, I'm going to give it a C. I could be better, could be worse. It's a C. All right, that looks like a lot of folks. And how many are going to say, it's pretty bad, I'm going to give it a D or an F? All right, so these are the tough graders here. So I'd like you now just to take a minute or two, introduce yourself to the person sitting next to you, tell them what you gave it, and tell them why. So this is 2 or 3 minutes to talk about this piece and what you thought. That was a great conversation. You could talk about that piece for a long time. But now that you've had a little chance to talk to your colleagues, how many of you now say, I'm going to change my grade from my first grade that I gave it? A few. Okay, how many say, now that I'm going to change my grade, it's going to be higher than it was before? Nobody? How many say, it's probably going to be lower than it was before? Okay, so those people that are changing their grade are actually making it lower. I'm going to come back to this piece at the end, and we'll talk about it in light of some of the research that we're going to look at. I do have a pretest for you. If you don't have your handout, don't worry. I have everything on these slides, and we'll go from there. So, true or false, graphics are most helpful for visual learners. How many think that's a true statement? Graphics are helpful for visual learners. Okay, good. How many think it's false? Okay, a few. All right, if you have a visual, let's say a complex visual, it's good to explain it with both audio and text. Let's say it's some kind of e-learning, audio and text to accommodate learning styles. How many would say that's a true statement? Audio and text. Okay? Who say no, that's false? Okay, good. So we have a little, almost half and half on that one. Instructor-led training, when all is said and done, there's nothing like instructor-led training. Is that true? How many say that's true? Okay, that's why we're all here, right? We're in a face-to-face environment. So we'll see the evidence on all of these. How many of you collect the little ratings at the end of your courses? The little student rating sheets, usually. We call them smile sheets. So if you get higher student ratings, which gives you a warm fuzzy, can you feel confident then that you've had better learning? Is there a correlation between student ratings and learning? How many think it's true that there is a positive correlation between student ratings and learning? True. How many say true? Not too many optimists out here, just a few. Okay, so how many think that's false? All right, most of us are more on the cynical side of this, so we'll see the evidence on that. If you want to build understanding, would it be better to present a more realistic visual? How many think that is a true statement? More realistic visuals are better. How many think it's false? Okay, a few. The majority are going for realistic visuals. Stories. How many of you have some kind of stories in your training? Yes. So stories are very powerful. Do interesting stories improve learning? How many think that's a true statement? Okay, good. A lot of popularity for stories. All right, good. So hopefully this activated your prior knowledge about some of what we're going to talk about in our hour here or so together. Okay, so let's start off with learning styles, one of my really favorite topics. And let me ask you this. Now, of course, there's lots of different learning styles, so I'm just going to zoom in on one of the more popular ones, and that is the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And let me ask you right now what your thought is about your own personal learning style. So how many of you would say, I am primarily a visual learner? You're A. Raise your hand. I'm a visual learner. Okay, good. How many of you would say, I'm primarily an auditory learner? Raise your hand. How many would say, I'm a kinesthetic, a hands-on learner primarily? Okay, good. So most people, like you, have no problem kind of jumping in and saying, this is my learning style. But the question is, what really is the truth about learning styles? A lot of time and money invested in learning styles, right? How many of you have some kind of learning styles, inventories, or programs back at your own training sites? Anybody? It's a pretty popular thing that we see in a lot of arenas. So I did want to tell you about this research on learning styles. This was published in 2006. The references are in the book and also in the handout. So they took 60 people, and they did 3 things with each person in the group. The first thing they did was do what we just did here. They said, are you a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? And like you, most of those folks had no problem saying, I'm a visual, auditory, or I'm a kinesthetic. Next, they gave everybody an inventory, a learning style inventory. I am not personally familiar with this particular one. I know there's lots of them around. So it was like a little test that you took, and the test told you you were visual, you were auditory, you were kinesthetic. Then they gave everybody a memory test. Actually, 3 memory tests. One was a visual test, so you got to look at a visual, then they took it away and you had to recreate it. A second one was you heard a story or heard some information and then you had to repeat it back. And the third one was a kinesthetic test. You were blindfolded and you could feel actually like some puzzle pieces, and then you had to identify them later. So then they were looking to see, well, what is the correlation between these? Like if you say you are a visual learner, then you would score higher on the visual part of the learning style inventory, and you would do better on a visual test compared to an auditory and a kinesthetic, and so forth. So then they did a correlation among all of these different measures with these folks. So what was the correlation? What did they find out? Have we built suspense? No relationships. No relationships among any of those 3 different measures. And so we have a conclusion which is that perhaps this whole idea of learning styles is not well grounded. And I'm going to show you some additional evidence around what works with visuals and audio and text based on evidence. So this is a very charismatic idea. I know a lot of us are very attracted to the idea of learning styles. But in the book, in the first chapter, I say, if you do nothing else as a result of reading this book, but give up the idea of learning styles, I'll be really happy. So, therefore, if learning styles aren't really valid, what do we know about how to use graphics, audio, and text? So that's what we're going to take a look at here in this next piece. I do want to introduce you to Dr. Rich Mayer. Anybody familiar with Dr. Mayer's work? Okay, great. He is at the University of California at Santa Barbara. You should get familiar with his work. He has been working in multimedia learning. And when I say multimedia, I don't mean computers per se. He defines multimedia as learning environments that use both graphics and words. So it applies across the board. And he has, in his work, proposed a number of principles. I've put up just 5 of them here that we're going to touch on today. His evidence is primarily experimental. And remember I said current best evidence, and I am. Remember, I was a science major, so you'll forgive me for being drawn to experimental evidence. So basically what you do is you have a pool of learners, and you randomly assign them to 2 different versions or 3 different versions of a lesson. The lessons are identical in all ways except for the one thing you're trying to study. So, for example, you might be looking at the value of graphics. So one version might have text and graphics, and a second version would have the same text but no graphics. That's just an example. So then you have groups randomly assigned. After they take it, they take a test, and then we crunch some numbers and do some statistical analysis and see what the results actually were. So most of Rich Mayer's research and others is experimental, and that's what I'm going to be reporting to you or summarizing for you today. There is a lot of wonderful research available, but it's not so easy to find it. It's in a lot of technical journals. You have to dig out the journal. You have to read the article. Sometimes they're not that easy to read. And then you have to say, is this relevant to me? So that's what I've tried to do in our presentation today and in my books. So let's ask our first question. Do graphics improve learning?